Start? David, do you mind we will start now?
Absolutely. I'm ready to go when you're ready.
We'll start. Okay. Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Benny Tai, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Law, HKU, and welcome to the Law and Religion Seminar organized by the Center for Comparative and Public Law, Faculty of Law, University of Hong Kong. The theme of this seminar is freedom, civil society, and the state. And as this is part of our law and religion series, surely we will try to explore these three very important concepts, freedoms, civil society, and the state, from the perspective of law and religion. And we have three very distinguished speakers with us. But you can only see two speakers here, because one of our speakers, Dr. Jonathan Chaplin, Director, Kirby Laing Institute for Christian Ethics, Cambridge. He has a sudden illness and could not come to Hong Kong. But fortunately, that's after some examination that actually he did not have any serious problem with his health. So, but just that the doctor advised him not to take the flight to Hong Kong to have some more rest. But fortunately, we have a paper written by him. So and actually he has given me the permission to read the paper out on his behalf. So we still have Dr. Jonathan Chaplin presenting his views in this session. And we have David Cavernani, convener of National Union of Journalists, BBC World News. And also we have Dr. Bob Fu, founder and president of China Aid, with us. And I think they will present to you directly, personally. And the arrangements for today's session is that the first part will be the reading of Dr. Jonathan Chaplin's paper, and then will be followed by Mr. David Cavernani's presentation. And after that, we'll have a coffee break. Then we'll be followed by Dr. Bob Fu's presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So I will start directly by reading the paper of Jonathan Chaplin, and the title is Why an Independent Civil Society and the Rule of Law Are Also Good for the State. The idea I want to propose is not a new one and can be stated simply. A state becomes stronger when it upholds and nurtures a strong civil society composed of a wide array of self-governing organizations possessing high degrees of legal and operational independence from state control. There is no trade-off between a successful state and a robust realm of personal and associational autonomy. The relationship between a strong state and a strong civil society is directly proportional, not inversely proportional. The importance of this claim will be immediately apparent to anyone living in Hong Kong at a time when the government of China is acting overtly and covertly to increase its direct control over civil society in mainland China and indirectly over elements of civil society in Hong Kong. I understand that the recent Communist Party plenum in Beijing offer further proof of this by, among other things, introducing further restrictive regulations on religion, notwithstanding the formal commitment of the Constitution to freedom of religious belief. The capacity of Hong Kong to demonstrate that a strong state needs a strong civil society, including a robust protection of religious freedom, but also much more, is critical for its own future, but also might have vital lessons for the rest of China for those open to learning them. But while the idea I want to discuss, that a strong state and a strong civil society need each other, is simply stated, it turns out to be quite complex. It derives its meaning from its place in a family of related political and legal ideas, practices and institutions, which must be grasped together. This includes the following: the inherent entitlement to personal and associational liberty and rights, secure legal and political space for genuine political pluralism, robust political debate, and the peaceful resolution of political differences, free elections, independent representative assemblies, a constrained executive under the rule of law, enforced by an independent judiciary, and so forth. And the rights implied in this list must not be seen as mere concessions of the state, but as independently valid claims to which the state must defer. Now, this family of ideas is familiar to anyone who understands the nature of a Western liberal democracy. But the account of them I won't give reflects distinctive but neglected sources of a liberal democracy in pre-modern, early modern, and modern Christian political thought. The core idea emerging from these sources can be summed up as theologically grounded vision of just, representative, constitutional government, a distinctively Christian version of constitutional democracy. Of course, one does not have to be a Christian to adhere to such a vision, but it is worth attending to these Christian sources for at least two reasons. First, they show that such a political order is not exclusively the product of secular Enlightenment thought, but trades on earlier religious notions which evolved over centuries into key elements of liberal democracy, even though those notions have now been largely forgotten or denied. An obvious implication is that a liberal democracy need not be officially atheist or anti-religious, but not even be officially secularist, that is committed to favoring or imposing a secular worldview as under French laicity. For example, with all the neatness, divisiveness it is currently stirring up, especially towards Muslims. Yet, a modern political order should indeed be secular in the narrow sense of being officially impartial towards different religions or belief systems. This idea derives specifically from streams of dissenting Protestantism since the 17th century. Thus, what I have called Christian constitutional democracy does not in any way seek to restore Christendom or claim any kind of public legal privilege for Christianity, even if it could secure an electoral majority. Thus, for example, Christian democratic parties in post-war Europe renounced that ambition, even when they did indeed win such majorities. In any event, the basic contours of such a model can be and need to be affirmed from a variety of religious or philosophical perspectives. Second, the extraordinary recent growth of Christianity in China makes the relationship between liberal democracy and Christianity of exceptional interest. Recent estimates suggest that there are now more Christians in China than members of the Communist Party. Christianity is possibly predicted to be 1/3 of the population by 2040. Whatever its actual growth trajectory, it is already set to exercise substantial influence, a prospect that is no doubt one of the drivers of the Chinese government's new restrictions on religion. We are thus led to ask, will China's burgeoning Christians seek to become active Christian citizens and political leaders? And if so, what goals will they pursue and by what means? What form of political order might they seek to promote? Such an order will not be and should not be a straightforward imitation of ideas birthed in the Christian liberal West. But since Chinese Christians share the same biblical and traditional inheritance as the Christian West, and since exchanges between them and Western Christians are increasing, we can expect strong affinities to emerge, even while distinctively Asian variations will appear. Might there emerge a distinctively Chinese rendition of what I've called Christian constitutional democracy? What might the contribution of the Hong Kong Christian community be to that? Minimally, in the short term, we can expect Chinese Christians to mount vigorous defenses of their own religious freedom. But in time, this might well draw them into wider commitments: religious freedom for all, freedom of speech for all, associational freedom for all, access to impartial justice for all, and so on. Potentially, we might even witness in a generation or two the emergence of a broad, articulate, well-mobilized popular movement of civic reform, or more likely, a series of heterogeneous movements committed to peaceful, gradual, constructive change, and guided by a vision of the common good of the whole nation. That, at least, would be a best-case scenario. Let me spell out this vision of a constitutional democracy through the lens of the idea of citizenship, by which I mean a political status rather than simply the possession of a passport. To simplify somewhat, classical secular liberal individualism sees citizenship as one of the necessary rights of the autonomous individual, necessary to protect their interests against the state and to give them power to shape the state and hold it accountable to the associated views of the self-interest individuals. The goals of limiting state power and holding state organs accountable to the people are profoundly important. But to construe the role of citizen primarily in terms of the promotion of self-interest is inadequate. It fails to convey that there are claims of the public realm which are not simply derivable from aggregated individual interests. Contemporary Republican theories of citizenship offer a better account, seeing the citizen as an active member of a self-governing political community. The Christian sources I have mentioned allowed us to go still further. They see citizenship as a participation in the moral vocation of the political community itself, a vocation not produced simply by the associated views of members, but arising from the objective moral obligations of political life, obligations we do not simply construct, but confront. In Christian thought, such obligations ultimately originate in the constitution of a divinely created social human nature in which everyone is indeed their brother's or sister's keeper, or as Pope John Paul put it, in which all are really responsible for all. On this view, the rights of the citizens derive not firstly from the need for self-protection or from negative liberty, but rather from a shared duty to contribute to the realization of justice and the common good, which of course include protection of fundamental individual interests and freedoms. This means two things. First, as member of the political community, citizens are co-responsible with government for discerning through democratic deliberation what justice and the common good require. Government cannot remotely presume to do this alone, and indeed is not competent to do so. This then calls for a wide, open, deliberative public sphere in which all political convictions, that is, all serious accounts of justice and common good, can be freely expressed and critically assessed, and out of which workable compromises can be struck in publicly representative forums. Second, citizens are also co-responsible for the practical realization of justice and the common good, since these are not the sole prerogative of the state. This certainly includes accepting the outcomes of democratic decisions, obeying the law, bracket, within the limits of conscience, bracket, and contributing in many non-political ways through all kinds of social, economic, cultural activity to the common realization of those larger goals. Crucially, it also means holding government to account via critical debate, mobilization, and various forms of peaceful opposition. A critical citizenry is a precondition of a just and stable state. This construal of citizenship issues in the demand that the state protect a robust, boisterous civil society populated by multiplicity of diverse and self-governing social, educational, professional, cultural, political, and religious associations. To these civil society organizations, we must also add two other categories not typically included in most definitions of civil society, but equally vital: families and households, and business enterprises, both as wealth creators and as participatory workplace communities. None of these bodies are organs of the state and thus may not be made subordinate to state purposes. Thus, for example, the abolition of China's one-child policy reverses an appalling injustice to families perpetuated by the Chinese state. This area of association and institutions is an indispensable condition for the cultivation and practice of citizenship, as I have defined it in two ways. First, an independent civil society helps prevent draconian state interventions in or creeping encroachments upon the personal freedoms and rights that are equally essential for active, responsible citizenship. But for this to be effective, civil society organizations, as well as families and businesses, must possess substantive institutional autonomy. They must be viewed as sources of original moral agency and legal competence. This is to expose what in jurisprudence is called the pluralistic theory of the sources of law. Not all law emanates from the will of the state. This obviously does not mean that such bodies operate above or beyond the law. They are legitimately subjected to a wide range of general laws essential to the promotion of justice and the common good. Rather, it means that general laws must be framed in ways that honor the original rights and powers of these bodies, that is, those that are inherent to the purpose of the body concerned. Parents have the inherent right to found a family, which means deciding on the size of their family. Businesses have the inherent right to choose their own production methods, product prices, and beyond a legal minimum, wage levels. Churches have the inherent right to determine their own doctrines, internal structures of authority, external communications. A constitutional freedom of individual private belief without freedom of corporate public practice is of little value. While few of these are unlimited or absolute rights, they are inherent or original rights, so that the onus should always be on the state to defend any restrictions on them, rather than on the institutions themselves to justify the possession or use of them. In the terms of American jurisprudence, there must be a compelling state interest in the restriction, and the bar of what counts as compelling should be set high. Such institutional rights must be rigorously defended by the legal system. They are as important as individual rights. Second, an independent civil society facilitates the nurture of the kind of people and communities equipped to exercise such citizenship. At least where they function reasonably well, civil society bodies are essential to the formation of needed civic virtues and skills, essential to the practices of reflection, debate, participation, self-discipline, self-denial, negotiation, tolerance, courage, and judgment, and so forth, required for effective citizenship. Each of the associations I listed above contributes to this in its own special way. Religious organizations, for example, where they function well, have been shown to nurture cooperation, self-denial, courage, and contrary to common perception, even tolerance. By contrast, the state or state-controlled institutions are very poorly equipped to cultivate such virtues and skills, and where they suppress or stultify these independent generators of such virtues and skills, they destroy the very social foundations for the discharge of their own capacity to promote justice and the common good. Such corrosion, of course, can be caused not only by authoritarian or collectivist regimes, but also by liberal ones, which sponsor a form of capitalism that systematically corrodes the spirit of solidarity and the moral energies without which even formerly free civil society bodies will wither up and die. Either way, states which undermine civil society in the long run dig their own graves. The account of a constitutional democracy, of which I've offered just a partial sketch, seeks to overcome both the individualist bias of secular Western liberalism, which fractures relational social bonds and obstructs the articulation of common political goals, while equally avoiding dangerous collectivist myths in which the state is the premier expression of human solidarity, or the orchestra of all social activities, or the font of all legal power, or the guardian of history and progress, or even the guarantor of endless economic growth. It proceeds from the primacy of social solidarity, in which free and responsible persons cooperate for the common good, over both individualist self-advancement and predatory statism. And this best Christianity has been one source of such a vision. If Christian communities in Hong Kong and China were to be well equipped to advance such a vision, they might turn out to be valued contributors to the evolution of the new China that is emerging before our eyes and by which the whole world will be impacted. After reading the whole paper of Dr. Jonathan Chaplin, actually before I read the paper, I did not know that we share so much ideas that are similar. And after reading that, most of the points I will agree. So actually, I've got the permission also from Jonathan that I can answer questions on his behalf. So because we share ideas so similar. And maybe I can also, in the question and answer session, may talk about at least my view on the role of the Hong Kong Christian community in the things that he has mentioned, that what might be the role of the Christian community in the democratic reform in Hong Kong, and maybe also what might be the possible role in the change in China in the future. So at least I have his permission to answer. Maybe my views may not really represent his views, but surely I will like to also contribute my part in this discussion. Thank you. Then we now have David Kamanani. He's the convener of the National Union of Journalists, BBC World News, and his topic is national broadcaster or state broadcaster, the Christian dimension of the BBC since not lauded with. Oh, yeah.
Right, so while that's been lined up, I'd just like to thank you so much for this kind invitation and for your time today. I want to make clear at the beginning that although I've worked for the BBC for 25 years as a journalist, the remarks I'm about to make don't reflect the views of the BBC. And although until just recently I've been on the national executive of the National Union of Journalists, they too would not want to associate themselves, I imagine, with the remarks I'm about to present. What I'm going to give to you is essentially a description of the emergence of the BBC as a national broadcaster. This Wednesday, the BBC will mark 80 years of public service television broadcasting. So it's quite an opportune moment to look at how the corporation has developed over the decades. I'm going to let you draw some of the conclusions and reflect on some of the points that have been made by Jonathan Chaplin. Jonathan and I go back 25 years in engagement in British politics from a Christian perspective. And it's great that we have an opportunity to share a platform, even though he can't be here today. So the key element that I've drawn from Jonathan's paper is that civil society precedes the state. And that's it's an obvious point of view, but it's worth stating. And that in turn, the individual on which and families which make up civil society, obviously their rights precede the state. But the argument I want to make today is that the early founders of the corporation were motivated by a vision that believes that the liberty of the individual, although promised by the state, actually is only meaningful in the context of relationships with other humans in a rich and diverse social order. So the one point of departure, I might say, in advance from Jonathan, is that when he describes a secular society, he means, what his remarks have said, is that he sees secular as being about the state being impartial between faiths. The tradition in Britain, actually, when it comes to what a secular society is actually closer to the idea that the role of the state in a secular world is to be engaged with the affairs of the world, not necessarily to avoid issues of religious motivation, because you can't understand the world without addressing preceding religious values and motivations. So why am I wanting to talk about the BBC? Well, I think early on in the life of the corporation, there was a very early recognition, going back 80, 90 years, that the medium of radio and television is going to be powerful. And today, new technologies pose similar questions about who owns and who regulates and holds accountable media, which we use every day and which shape our world. Now, 80 years of television broadcasting also makes another point for us. The emergence of modern governance institutions, or the structures of governance, takes time, but they are relatively new. So what role is there for the state in the emergence of these structures in between the individual and the state? How do we determine what is the state interest and what is the national interest? And isn't it interesting that politicians always claim, whenever they act outrageously, that of course they're only doing it for the national interest? It's a common theme wherever you are, whether east or west. So what mediates? Are rules enough? So in the UK, trust in British public institutions and indeed abroad and our major corporations isn't exactly fantastic. So you see the divide there between the Union flag and the European Union flag. Well, Brexit, the whole theme of the Brexit debate in the UK was, we don't trust the experts. We're even dubious of the broadcasters who are mediating what the experts say, because of course the assumption of people who are wanting to see the UK leave the European Union was, can we really be sure that the broadcasters are trustworthy? Clinton v. Trump, the common theme today is that, are they really the best choice that the United States has to offer? Doesn't this in turn reflect the failure of the Republican-Democratic Party divide in America? What about HBOS and other banks, even those familiar to you like HSBC? We've had, since 2008, serial banking failures around the world, but particularly in Britain, all subject to various city investigations. The offshoring of company registrations in tax havens to smother transparency, to dodge accountability for payment of tax. This too has undermined trust in the financial system. Crime figures. We've got a picture here of a policeman during the Orgreave miners' strike of the early 1980s, hitting a civilian. Trust in the British police is also in doubt. Some of you will be familiar with the Hillsborough disaster, the deaths of Liverpool football fans, the lies that emerged following a massive inquiry into what happened there, perpetrated by the British police. You'd have thought this institution, above all, had the trust of the British people. Take it closer to home, phone hacking in the media, confidence in the BBC with nationally prominent broadcasters found out to be perpetrators of sexual abuse. Members of Parliament, some of you will know that our British MPs have been fiddling their expenses, pocketing what they weren't entitled to. So here's a great quote from a former oil executive. He happens to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. So we're seeing a decline in trust in institutions, but he says this: a key mark of decline in a wide range of institutions or movements is the massive capacity for analysis of problems, but no capacity to treat the problems identified. The theme everywhere, as I've been describing in recent decades, is poor governance, lack of accountability, regulation that is found wanting, insufficient boundaries between the corporations of the state, the place of the individual, and the idea of national interest, and the connivance of those with authority, people who should actually have known better, to hide these realities. What is sought then, I believe, is a common desire for ethical leadership. They want the public, the British public, I'm describing Britain, they want ethical leadership by independent people who take responsibility for their roles. They want speedy responses to public concerns. They want to move away from the blame culture where institutions are going wrong. You've heard of whistleblowers. Even in the UK today, to be a whistleblower about internal corruption of institutions, it's always the whistleblowers who get driven out of the corporation, not the perpetrators. I can say there's a trade union. I was the chairman of the National Union of Journalists in BBC News. We've had a series of problems of bullying of staff. The bullying in the journalist trade is, whether it's the print industry or the broadcast industry, is a serious problem. And whistleblowers of that were always the ones made to leave the BBC. So I'm saying today that we have a lack of confidence then in our public corporations in the UK, and that confidence needs to be renewed. And so I began to ask myself the question, where did some of that notion of ethical leadership, ethical focus, the idea of vocation in public life, where has that come from and how did we lose it? Because the fact is that these ideas, informed by Christianity in Britain, have developed and have been responsible for the development of our public bodies, not just in Britain, but also in the Commonwealth. So the Christianity has shaped the purpose of our institutions and anchored these public figures that have been brought into doubt. Historically, their idea of vocation in their public service was rooted in the Christian faith. I want to quote a bit of Karl Marx for you today. He was right when he said, and you'll be familiar with this remark, in every epoch, the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. In Britain, the ideas of the ruling class were informed by the established Christian faith, the Church of England. And those ruling ideas were reflected in the strength of a Christian biblical worldview in the emergence of our public institutions. It didn't matter that not everyone went to church. It didn't matter that those who supported notionally the idea of Christianity shaping our institutions, themselves having a personal faith. Nevertheless, they still signed up to faith informing these ideas. So I'm going to move on and talk specifically now about the BBC. It was founded in 1922. Its first broadcasting began in 1936. And this man here, John Reith, was the first Director General. A Scottish Presbyterian, his father was the convener of the Free Church of Scotland. He grew up as a Calvinist. And he was responsible for shaping, even today, we still look back on this particular individual as shaping the sense of what the BBC is today. We're the world's oldest and we continue to be the largest national broadcaster in the world. We reach a weekly audience of 348 million people. But what's really interesting about this man was that he sensed very, very early on that he believed that God had destined him for the work of creating a broadcasting service. So his biography, a biography written about him, just published recently, called The Expense of Glory, A Life of John Reith, written by Ian McIntyre, he said this about Reith, how Reith engaged with the idea of a broadcasting service. He went to church one evening, and the minister preached from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 22, on the guilt of Jerusalem. And this is the words from the book of Ezekiel that really had an impact on Reith's vision for the BBC. And it's quite sort of literalist. I sought for a man among them that they should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. This is what Reith wrote. So this is what the minister went on to say. Perhaps there was someone in the church that very night who would save the country from heathendom, immorality, and love of money. And Reith wrote in his diary that night, I still believe there is some high work for me in the world, but that it won't come till I've reconciled myself absolutely to God's way of working. The next morning over breakfast, Reith was in the habit of taking his morning newspaper, and whilst eating his toast, would pray over what he would read. And he saw this advert in the Morning Post. The BBC in formation, applications for general manager, etc. He decided to apply, and being invited to interview, this is what his biography says. The previous night, Reith had put all before God, but that was the limit of his preparation. He says this about his job interview, and some of you will be looking for careers and facing job interviews. I'd just love it if you did the same. Don't do the same, I should say, but this is what he did. I'm quoting from his diary. The fact is, I hadn't the remotest idea as to what broadcasting was. I hadn't troubled to find out. So he went into an interview having no idea what broadcasting was, having prayed about it, thought it was a good thing to do. The next day, he was offered the job. But what's key about this is that what motivated him was a sense of calling, a sense of vocation. What do you feel is your interest? What motivates you? He felt himself to have a moral vision for this particular post, even though he didn't know what it was. And what's key was that he divided the idea of serving money and serving God. He felt that the profit motive could not be part of anything to do with what he was to build in the corporation. He believed that the BBC, as a national broadcaster, should be free of the state and free from making profits. He believed airways were a national asset to be owned and operated by the nation for the nation. So the corporation was set up for 10 years and a charter presented to the Commons. So in that charter, which defined the public purpose of the BBC whilst he was Director General, he was motivated by the idea that a broadcaster should be entertaining, it should be motivated by the idea of informing the public and educating them. That was the vision. But he also said this. He justified the idea of a broadcasting monopoly because he said the Christian religion and the Sabbath might not have had the place and protection they had, the place and protection which it was right to give them. So Reith believed actually it was not just appropriate but essential to privilege the BBC's position in public life and to privilege Christianity in public life for the good of the nation. And you'll see that written in the Latin is the vision statement, the mission statement. They're still there in the main entrance to Broadcasting House in central London. So on the evening, he had dinner with the Prime Minister, Baldwin. And I'm making this just to be descriptive of what was in the minds of the first legislators that set up the BBC. And again, this is recorded in his biography. Reith spoke seriously about social purpose and what he called common sense Christian ethics. The supply of good things, he said, created the demand for more. He ventured to believe that a new national asset had been created and that down the years it would bring what he called the compound interest of happier homes, broader culture, and truer citizenship. So there's this striking claim that truer citizenship is actually rooted in a worldview that embraces, without any apology, the Christian worldview. And so we see in the Latin here that this was put up in 1931 in the entrance hall from a version of Paul's letter to the Philippians from chapter 4, verse 8. And this mission statement, this is translated, simply says this temple of the arts and muses is dedicated to Almighty God by the first governors of broadcasting in the year 1931, Sir John Reith being Director General. It's their prayer that good seed sown may bring forth a good harvest, that all things hostile to peace or purity may be banished from this house, and that the people, inclining their ear to whatsoever things are beautiful and honest and of good report, may tread the path of wisdom and uprightness. So here is a very early public corporation that absolutely rooted its public service motivation in a Christian ethical vision. No apology, no excuse. They embraced it as essential to their public purpose. Even his successors as Director General also adopted that specific Christian perspective. And Sundays, according to Sir John Reith, were for broadcasting of what he called a straightforward and manly religion. It was for the application of the teaching of Christ to everyday life. No pluralist, neutral state here. We don't see that in the emergence of the early public corporation at the BBC. So Sir John Reith saw broadcasting as what he called the unique means of bringing an authoritative expression of Christian opinion to the widest public, including the Christian community. And he said in 1949, in a book that he wrote, the intention was to carry into the greatest number of homes everything that was best in every department of human knowledge, endeavour, and achievement, and to avoid whatever was or might be hurtful. Of course, to declare something hurtful is a prejudgment of the idea of morality. If you're going to declare something harmful, you have to have a pretty good idea, in your view, of what that might look like. And at that time, I think there was a secular consensus around the Christian worldview. And he appointed a director of religious broadcasting who was explicit at that time in wanting the BBC to, quote, reaffirm the centrality of the Christian faith for the survival of Christian civilization, which, of course, they associated essentially, particularly in the faiths of totalitarianism in Europe and even in Asia, they associated Christian civilization as the essential bastion against totalitarianism. So what we see from this Reithian vision then are national ideals and values stemming from the Christian bedrock of that era, and that these transcend any state interest. Reith went further. So we see that on the left here, Broadcasting House, again with that Latin inscription. You see behind him the picture of the sower, a sculpture made by Eric Gill, referring to the Gospels, the idea of sowing good seed. Again, another powerful Christian emblem of what good broadcasting was about. But I want to move on and talk about the BBC as a public corporation, because, of course, his Calvinism which informed the development of the corporation, told him that there are spheres of responsibility, as we were hearing from Jonathan's paper, that sit between the individual and the state. And this is from the BBC's website. You can look it up yourselves, the history of the BBC. Reith's passionate belief in public service broadcasting led him to propose an innovation to the running of the state. He put forward the idea of a public corporation run at arm's length from the government, but supervised by a board of governors. The corporation would still be run day to day by its managers, but instead of representing a company's investors in the drive for profits, the governors would put the public or the national interest first. So you see then this idea that you need to avoid state interference, you need to avoid or at least introduce mechanisms to resist the demands of the commercial interest, and that your governance structures were to be put in place that were to guarantee what he felt to be notions of the public or corporate interest. So my view, and I'll state it here, is that the bedrock of values implemented in practice in the organisation of public institutions sustains those places or spaces for liberty. When the shared assumptions around what our institutions should look like begin to break down, then the institutions themselves lose their coherence. They become vulnerable to abuse of individuals, and they become vulnerable to the same thing, actually, in many cases, commercial interests taking over and subverting the national interest. These things only have value when actually they're put to the test. And very early on in the life of the BBC, this idea that there's a national interest that transcends the state interest was challenged by the national strike or the general strike of 1926. Some of you will be familiar with that incident when millions of workers collectively went on strike in Britain. Even quite early on in the life of the BBC, it was the only independent voice available to the citizen to describe what was going on in the nation at that time. Now, Winston Churchill was the Home Secretary, and he was very clear. He felt the BBC should be a government mouthpiece. Reith, however, because he was motivated by these Christian ideals, said, actually, it would have been better for me and worse if he had given in to Churchill. But he said it would have been worse for the BBC and worse for the country. So Reith actually resisted Churchill and pleaded to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, not to allow the corporation to be captured by state interests. But you know, there was another voice in the British establishment that also wanted to use the BBC, and that was actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, the national religious leader at that time. He wanted to use the BBC to make a broadcast to appeal for an end to the strike. So there are other interests who want to use these powerful platforms for their own purpose. He felt that it was the right thing to do. But the BBC resisted that and said, actually, no, we're not going to be used like that as a political mouthpiece. So these actions actually have a great powerful effect in determining the independence of a national institution. But what he did do was to permit the Trade Union Congress, which was the association of all the British trade unions. He reported, so the news services of the BBC carried reports from the Trade Union Congress about what was happening during the strike and what motivated them. So today, impartiality continues to remain a key BBC concept. But what we've seen is that John Reith at least felt that there was no need for impartiality when it came to faith. So impartial between interests, certainly not taking the side of the state, but there was no impartiality in terms of the bedrock of values which shaped the emergence of the BBC. Reith was succeeded by Sir William Hayley as Director General in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War. And in a policy address, Hayley stated that the BBC seeks to safeguard Christian values and to foster acceptance of them. So even after Reith, his successors felt that there was a public purpose, again, this idea that Christian civilization identifies liberty and therefore itself being the protector of liberty, we need to sustain one if we're to get the other. Hayley declared, the whole preponderant weight of the BBC's programmes is directed towards this end. This is to say, the acceptance of a worldview rooted in Christianity. Reith, in turn, said he believed the aims of religious broadcasting were to make Britain, quotes, a more Christian country. What about today? Interestingly, the BBC has rejected those founding values. When I was chairman of the trade union, I did this this wasn't a trade union act, but we moved into a new building. But in this slide, you can see behind Old Broadcasting House on the left, you see this new building off to the right. It's a £1 billion building, and we've consolidated all our broadcasting services, radio, World Service Radio, World Service TV, where I work, national network, television and radio, are all consolidated and on online services in that building. And the BBC opened with, you've seen it was dedicated by the governors, the building on the left when it opened. And I thought, I'm going to write to Chris Patton, you'll be familiar with him, who was chairman of the BBC, and said to him, well, you dedicated, why don't you dedicate the new building to God? And Chris Patton, who loves avoiding taking decisions he doesn't have to take, said, matters to do with the building are not to do with the chairman. I'll refer you to the Executive Director General, Lord Hall. So I wrote to Lord Hall, and he wrote back when I said, why don't you dedicate the new building? In fact, I even came up with a scripture. You've seen the verse that was taken from the New Testament for the old building, and I suggested one from the book of Haggai, chapter 2, verse 9. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts, and in this place will I give peace. And this is what the Director General, this is Lord Hall, my boss, this is what he wrote, one of his staff wrote back to me. In 2013, because that's when we had an exchange of letters, in a multi-faith BBC in UK, it feels slightly inappropriate to dedicate the building solely via a Christian dedication. So we'll certainly look at a way of marking this important moment whilst also drawing in wider faiths. So what do you actually think he was saying here? When an English civil servant or a minion of the Director General writes to you and says, we'll certainly look at a way of marking this important moment, do you actually think he meant drawing in other faiths? What do you think actually happened? What actually happened was that no faiths were involved at all. The Queen turned up and I think cracked a bottle of champagne, and that was about it. When you get a communication like this, what they're saying is, we're embarrassed by our Christian roots, haven't got a clue what it's got to do with the world in the 21st century. We'll use the cover of a multi-faith Britain to actually get rid of God entirely from the public space. So there were no imams, there were no Hindu priests, the chief rabbi wasn't invited, certainly no Church of England bishops. So what actually he was stating here was clearly the excuse of multi-faith, pluralist, secular Britain is actually an excuse to evacuate Christianity entirely from the public space. So at the time, the BBC was criticised for lacking vision and vocation. And it's quite interesting, at the same time as the BBC was disconnecting itself from the Christian roots, I know I've jumped a couple of decades, I'm just giving you the contemporary picture. As it jumped away from that, as it moved away from seeing the reflection of those Christian values or perspectives in terms of the content of its broadcasting, we began to see criticism of those at the very top of the organisation. We've seen repeated scandals over the pay of BBC bosses. We've seen the abuse that I've mentioned earlier of journalists. We've seen the BBC producing reports where its facts were simply wrong. We've seen very bad financial decisions, financial mismanagement where hundreds of millions have been wasted. Lord Hall here was charged by the BBC Trust with immediate reform of the BBC's management culture just several years ago. they said it had to be his first and top priority. There was a review into the failings of the BBC by a man called Pollard, and the Pollard review into the failures at a particular programme, Newsnight, damningly found what they called leadership and organisation being in short supply at the BBC. So it seems when you lose your values, all too often at the very top of the organisation, you seem to, and you've lost this idea of vocation, you very quickly lose that visionary leadership that gives a sense of national purpose to the organisation. I just put it to you that I just think it's no coincidence that those happened at that time. So what have been the consequences? What are we seeing at this very moment? So in Britain, you heard earlier in my presentation that every 10 years the BBC sees a new royal charter to govern it. And we're going through that royal charter process at the moment. A royal charter isn't like a piece of government legislation. It can be put through Parliament without any vote of Parliament, and that's what's going to happen. Because the BBC has lost confidence, both the government's lost confidence in the BBC, the state has tried to break in with new commercial imperatives, and the state has decided to interfere in the national broadcaster. So instead of having a trust that governs what the executive does, that remember I earlier described the Reithian idea of on the one hand the executive team, and on the other a board of trustees or governors that would oversee what the executive team are doing, the government at the moment, the Conservative government, are imposing a unitary board. So you're going to combine the executive team with national appointees. For the first time in the history of the BBC, editorial policy will be subject to interference by political appointees. It's a very serious development. In the last 5 years of the Conservative government, a quarter of the value of the funding mechanism for the BBC, what's called the licence fee, everyone in Britain that has television has to pay a tax. It's a licence fee of about £112 a year. But a quarter of it has been diverted by the state towards its own purposes. So we're seeing further editorial oversight. For the first time, the National Audit Office, they have the power to subpoena financial papers of the BBC. And every aspect of the BBC is now subject to a government agency, Ofcom, which also regulates other aspects of broadcasting. And my final point about the impact of the loss of vision and leadership at the top is that old Reithian dynamic, we cannot ever be in a position where we're reliant on the profit motive, that also has now been fatally undermined. The BBC has determined in this latest charter process, the government has determined that the BBC has to rely on commercial revenue for its purposes. So they're diverting a quarter of the tax for other purposes of the state, and they're making the BBC subject to the profit motive. And the majority of radio production will be privatised. So if you take the view that private rights or individual liberty is best guaranteed, it's hidden, though, in this wider complex nexus of relationships of this rich and diverse civil society, the moment you lose the web of values, the vision of the nation, then it's easy for the state interest to replace what is the national interest. So the secular state interest takes the place of the religious or Christian values, vision and motivation. My last slide, as I draw to a close, it's time for a cup of tea. Is it just me that's saying this? Is it just the BBC that we can observe these kind of remarks? The presentation I'm giving, I can tell you, you will not hear other people in the BBC make the remarks I'm giving you. But interestingly, the Guardian newspaper hit in on the same idea just a few months ago at the beginning of the summer. They asked this question in an editorial: disappearing Christianity, what happens? Suppose it's gone forever. And they said this: the idea that people have some rights just because they're human